Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Who Watched the Watchmen panel. My name is Mark McPherson. I'm a film critic for TwinCitiesGeek.com, FilmInquiry.com, FilmShop.com, and MoviesWithMark.com. So, on this panel, we're going to be looking at the Watchmen in the three different aspects: the original comic book, the movie adaptation of the comic book, and the sequel TV series. So we will start off with the first slide here of the comic. Yep. So we'll go to the next slide after the title. So we're going to be talking about like the comic book first. So the comic book was like a huge deal when it came out, and it was by Alan Moore, and Alan Moore was all about sort of taking superheroes in the comic books into like the next level and basically giving them a postmodern edge. So sort of like questioning, what it meant to be superheroes and sort of turning it on its head. He had done stuff like this with like Batman and the Killing Joke, and Watchmen was kind of going to be like the ultimate like questioning and like satire of superheroes. So like the original that Moore had for doing this was that he was going to take the characters from Carlton Comics that were recently acquired by DC. So these would have been characters like Blue Beetle and The Question, and he was basically going to take these characters and give the and just like basically kind of like trash them, like show what happens like when they get older, and their ways have become like a little bit old fashioned, and they haven't really made the world a better place, they've actually made it worse. And it's going to comment on the Cold War and politics, but that was the original idea. But like DC Comics decided against that when they realized, well, this is Alan Moore. He's going to take these characters that we just acquired and just do horrible things. Like I think the quote was something like they're going to have like brain damage or something like that. They were going to do he was going to do something bad to him. So essentially, what he ended up doing was kind of making an original version with different versions of like the Carlton Comics characters, as well as a few familiar characters that people might know from other DC comics. So and because of that, they're like the comic book was considered quite original, even though if DC had gone around with what Moore wanted to do, it would have been a very striking comic book for the time. It would have fit in with like stuff like the Killing Joke and stuff like that, but it would have been much different. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll go to our first character. So we're going to be talking about like the biggest character who's kind of like the instigator of all this in the story is Adrian Veidt. So for those who haven't read the comic book, this is going to be a little bit of a spoiler, but the whole idea behind Watchmen is that it takes place in 1985. Nixon is still president. The Cold War is like heating up, like nukes are getting ready to fly, and they've just found out that a superhero called the Comedian has died. And so they're trying to figure out who killed the comedian, and how did this happen. So while they try to figure out who killed the comedian, they unravel the whole history behind superheroes that was anything but glamorous. It was just hideous and horrible. So we cover a few different characters. One of the characters we cover is Adrian Veidt, who is known as Ozymandias, who is the smartest man in the world. And he's taken all this knowledge and power that he has and has basically turned it into a business empire. He's become like a CEO. He thinks highly of himself, and he believes that only he can save the world. Like, like only I know the answers to everything. So he's very, very egotistical. And he actually turns out to be like the secret villain in the end, because the ending is basically Ozymandias sends a giant squid to New York and convinces the world that interdimensional monsters are coming and that they have to band together. So because of this, Ozymandias has to stage this elaborate plot that involves like, the death of millions. And he just sort of gets away with it by the end, believing that, I did it. Like that's like the big thing with that. Um, he's exceptionally full of himself because if you read the comic book, there's several passages where he will just drone on and on about how he went to the desert and he took drugs and how like this made him as great as Alexander the Great, and he just keeps going on and on. Like he literally bores his scientists to death before he sets this plan into motion. Um, So like he seems like the most obvious villain considering he gets away with it, and including like the quintessential moment where he reveals his plan to the heroes and then says, "Well, I already did it like half an hour ago." So like why would you think I'd tell you? That makes no sense. So we'll go to the next slide now. And now we'll address like kind of the more one of the characters is considered a bit more of a hero, which is Dan Dryberg, who plays Night Owl. This is the second iteration of Night Owl. The first was his father, and basically Dan has kind of become like a washed-up hero. You know, he's older, he's overweight, he's impotent, and he doesn't really have a drive to to continue to continue being a hero. He's basically felt like he basically feels like the world has kind of like turned its back on heroes and that he doesn't have a place in it anymore and can't quite comprehend what he can do anymore. So he's kind of like the overweight, pathetic, sad superhero who can't quite get out of his funk. The other thing too is that he's afraid of relationships. So later in the story, he does form a relationship with Lori, but it's one that's hard for him. It's one that he's not quite sure if he's willing to take that next step. He also has the most gadgets, like he's framed after the Blue Beetle, but you could kind of see a little bit of like Batman in him too, where he's got all these gadgets, and he has like a ridiculous owl. Forget what it's called, but it's like an owl mobile. It's just like a giant sphere that looks like an owl. Um, and yeah, and he's very like flexible in his logic too. Like when it gets up to the climax where Ozymandias tries to convince everyone that what he did was right, Dan just sort of goes with it because Dan doesn't really think that much about about like the bigger picture of justice. So it's a character that he wants to do the right thing, but you kind of hate him at the same time because he never quite does the right thing. So go to the next slide now. And this is kind of the one character who most people would consider the biggest villain, which is Edward Blake, the comedian. And he's considered the more obvious villain in the story. I mean, like pretty much every, there is no real hero in this story, but the more obvious villain is the comedian for a number of reasons. I mean, he's abusive, he's sexist, he's an alcoholic, he rapes people, he murders people, and he's very, very nationalistic, especially in like the twilight years that they show in the 70s. So yeah, the comedian is one of these like characters, like he's comparable to I forgot the character's name from The Boys, but basically yeah, he's a character who embraces nationalism, but he also has a lot more in common with the Joker, not just for being called the comedian, but because he embraces a nihilism. Like in the few remaining days of his life, they show how he doesn't really have like a concept of justice and doesn't really care to seek it out either. Like he just becomes this bitter, depressed drunk. And we kind of reveal that in backstories because like the comic book opens with Blake dying. Like he's murdered within like the first few frames of the comic book. So that's the route he takes. He's modeled after Peacemaker, who few people will notice is coming in the upcoming Suicide Squad movie. So just kind of imagine this version of Peacemaker, if you will. He's really not a likable character. Even though for like one scene he's trying to like show the humanity of John, but like he can't quite muster it. So we'll go to the next character, which is probably the most popular character, which is Dr. Manhattan, also known as Dr. John Osterman. He was a scientist who, in a freak lab accident, basically became omnipresent. So he was endowed with these special powers that allowed him to change his shape, to change his skin, to manipulate matter, to manipulate time, and and the most important aspect of him is that he's become aware of time itself, specifically his own timeline. So he can basically perceive his past and his future all at the same time, and it's kind of made him just more of like like a hopeless nihilist. Like he believes that there's a script that he has to follow in life and that he's bound by it and that there's no way to escape it, and he doesn't even try to escape it. And this pretty much brings out an inhumanity with him where he doesn't really connect with anybody. He does have relationships with the first Silk Spectre and then the second Silk Spectre. It's easier to maintain because he's immortal, but because he's immortal, he doesn't really feel that he can grow and age with people and maintain relationships. And he's basically just tired of humanity. So he's most likely to side with Adrian. He's kind of based on Captain Atom, kind of like he has similar powers and like taking in energy and stuff like that, and it kind of works its way into the climax. You can kind of see shades of it, um, but he kind of feels like a little bit more. Like I've heard tell that yeah, he's basically Captain Atom, but the whole deal with Captain Atom was that he could like take in energy and expel it, and Doctor Manhattan does a little bit more with it. He's a little bit more like a godlike figure. So we'll go on to the next character, who actually happens to be Dr. Manhattan's girlfriend for the first like quarter of the comic book, and then later hooks up with Dan just because Laurie G. Spexic is probably the one character you can sympathize with the most, just because she is the one who is most horrified by everything in this world. She's horrified by the past. She's horrified by what the superheroes have become. She's horrified by Ozymandias's plan, by Dr. Manhattan's inhumanity, and she's just not sure where to go. I mean, like she's the easiest character to sympathize with because she makes some great points about how John isn't looking at the big picture and how how egotistical he's become. Like she's like the lone voice of reason in like a few scenes from the comic book. So it's easier to like her, especially when she's such like a tragic character. When she learns that Edward Blake was her father after he raped her mother, and it's made all the more disgusting by the fact that that later Edward Blake tries to come onto her, and just feels gross about it all. So she's kind of like she's more or less the audience surrogate, where she reacts how we would expect ourselves to react in that situation. So let's go on to the next slide. And now, of course, we come to the most controversial and popular character of Watchmen, which is Rorschach, or Walter Kofax. So Rorschach's deal is basically like he's a parody of the Question. He's like a conspiracy theorist, but he could really be seen as like a satire, as basically every kind of like Batman-esque like hardcore vigilante out there, and all those like films where like the action hero always kills all the bad guys and gets justice that way. Now Rorschach is kind of seen as like for some people he's kind of seen as like the hero of the comic book. I mean, he really shouldn't, but he is, and I think that's mostly because of the way he's framed. Like they frame him like a detective. They make him seem cool. They make him seem gruff and gritty. But the thing is, like, if you actually pay attention to the comic, um, he's actually one of the more sinister characters, just for how much they reveal of him. Like, he investigates everything, like stuff that doesn't matter. Like, he looks into Ozymandias being a homosexual for no reason. It pertains to nothing in the case. Um, when interrogating people for information, he will go into bars and torture them, even though they won't know anything, so he won't get anything out of it. Um, the most probably the most troubling thing is that he reads a right wing rag called the New Frontiersman. Um, Now it's said kind of like it's spoken offhandedly, like it's right wing propaganda, but later in the comic book they actually do show an excerpt from it, and it's clear as day that yeah, it's right wing propaganda. There's a whole section in there about arguing about how the Ku Klux Klan had some good ideas about American values. So yeah, like and like this is not only the newspaper that Rorschach reads the most, but it's the one newspaper that celebrates him the most as well. So that's like a very troubling aspect. And the thing is, like, too, is if you keep reading the comic as it goes along, you'll see that Rorschach's dialogue becomes less and less more eloquent. Like he starts speaking in less coherent sentences. He'll start grumbling more. He'll just start saying like one or two word sentences when talking to people. Um, and yeah, like just and his plan of trying to reveal everything just doesn't work. And yeah, like his methods of trying to kill people and get revenge just blows up in his face, and it doesn't work in the end. So we'll go on to the next slide now. So now we're moving on to the film. So the comic book had a great legacy. It came out, everyone revered it. It's regarded as one of the best graphic novels of all time. It questioned a lot about superheroes and the Cold War. And talks for making a film were pretty early. Like they'd started, just as soon as the comic book had come out. So it remained kind of in like production hell for a long, long, long time. There were tons of directors who were jumping onto this project thinking that, oh, we could make Watchmen into a movie. And it's it's kind of been mentioned by Alan Moore as like, the most unfilmable of comic book stories, because really it's not like a typical superhero story that you can make for the big screen. It's questioning superheroes. It's making them seem, vile and horrible and disgusting and questionably immoral. So it's like it's such a hard sell to do that. And there've been numerous scripts that they've gone through this, numerous directors like Terry Gilliam and David Gordon Green. They've all like taken a whack at it, and it never took. So eventually, they arrived at picking Zack Snyder to direct the film. At this point, Snyder had directed two big films. So he directed the remake of Dawn of the Dead and the 300 from 2007. So, and what's interesting, I think, is you can kind of see where Watchmen would have gone if you watch 300, because if you look at like 300, it for Snyder, it's all about matching the panels, matching the frames, matching the setup, matching the grit and the atmosphere. Like that seems to be his drive when adapting comic books. And with Watchmen, it's the same deal. Like if you watching Watchmen, you can see that there's a lot of scenes that are shot for shot, just like the comic book. There's a lot of dialogue that is verbatim, just straight from the comic book. Um, but there's a problem with that as well, in that, Snyder wants to maintain this sort of like grit and fierceness to this, when the grander theme of Watchmen was sort of this postmodernism edge of questioning superheroes. And the film is kind of like taking the wrong message from the comic book. So like I mentioned, like the comic book, so the comic book was meant to, question these superheroes and see them as, not so heroic, and question their actions. Whereas the film sort of more embraces like this sort of like slick coolness. Like there are aspects of it that kind of just like don't make sense with the way they're posed. Like Rorschach is seen more cool than he was in the comic books. Dan is seen more as a typical superhero. Like he doesn't feel like he's like overweight and over the hill in this film. It seems like he's just like a little bit impotent, but he's still got like, the cojones to, break bones and go back to, crime fighting just perfectly. And the biggest change, and the biggest change obviously to the film, is the ending. Like the ending switches it up, where there's not a giant squid that goes to New York, but a bomb based on Dr. Manhattan's material. And that might seem like a more interesting angle, because then it forces Dr. Manhattan to play the role as the villain, and then, realize he can't live in this world anymore. But it changes the entire ending. Like for those who remember, like the ending of the comic book, it has Rorschach die alone in the snow after Dr. Manhattan kills him. It has Dan and Laurie yeah, having sex immediately just because they want an agency for their humanity. You have Adrian questioning if he did the right thing, and then Dr. Manhattan sort of takes off because he's tired of humanity and doesn't really have much hope for them. And the film sort of ends in this more awkward angle where it's more theatrical. Like Rorschach doesn't die alone. Dan is there to witness it and scream. Dr. Manhattan gives like a farewell kiss to Laurie, which is kind of bizarre that they would take that route. And Adrian is just kind of like, I won. Okay. So there's a lot of stuff that the film gets wrong. So let's go to the next slide, where we'll be generous here. We'll talk about what did the film get right. So like I said, it's faithful in the visuals. Like I said, it repeats a lot of the scenes. It's very, very faithful on a surface level for the visuals. It gets that stuff right. It doesn't try to like make it PG-13. It keeps all the ugliness and the brutality where the comedian kills a pregnant woman, where John makes hideous messes of like the people he attacks. They have the cursing. They have the some of the political edge in it. Not a lot though. It's kind of like it's kind of treated more banal than I think it should be. And it stays true to the era. Like it doesn't try to update it for like the like 2009. Like they know that the story takes place in the 80s. It's indicative of the 80s, and that you have to set it in that time for the Cold War. Yeah, in terms of like a slick presentation, Snyder gets it. Snyder delivers a good looking film. But let's go to the next slide. And like I said, the stuff that it gets wrong is just across the board. He gets themes wrong. He gets like some of the characters off. The tone is really off in a lot of scenes, and I think this has mostly to do with the fact with the choices in the soundtrack. So apparently, from what I understand, whole orchestral soundtrack that was made for the Watchmen film. But apparently Snyder threw out most of it in favor of just making pop culture choices. So songs indicative of the era. And they're really bizarre choices too. Like he chooses like Hallelujah, Hallelujah for the big makeout scene. In the owl ship, he chooses Everybody Wants to Rule the World for a scene in Adrian's office. And like it's kind of weird because like he chooses like strange choices that are indicative of the era but wouldn't really make that much sense. Like at one point he plays some of like Philip Glass's score from Koyaanisqatsi, which came out in 1982, and it's a great score. It's like very atmospheric, but it's like it kind of removes like the originality and kind of like takes you out of the film in several places. So like it has to like constantly remind you, yeah, this is the 1980s. Like, okay, I get it. Yeah, so embarrassing soundtrack, bizarre choices in costumes. Like I said, if you look at Night Owl's costume here, it's way too slick. It doesn't really communicate that he's been over the hill. Um, some of like the choices are very questionable. And then, like I said, the postmodern angle is not really like it's not really bolstered in this film. Like Rorschach is kind of seen more as the like pathetic character who who you constantly question throughout the comic book. And in the film, he's kind of portrayed as more cool, and they don't really question too much of his like political edge that like edges over towards fascism, where he's constantly saying he's going to get revenge on everyone, and that the world is just like filled with filth and liberals, and that he has to cleanse it all. Which makes his like dropping off of the diary and the very end of the comic book more troubling. But in the end of the film, it's portrayed as kind of more hopeful, like yes, Rorschach's gonna get revenge, and it's like that's not something we should be feeling by the end of the film. We should not be feeling that there. So yeah, that's kind of where the comic book goes. Okay, so next up, we will go to the next slide, which is the TV series. Now, the TV series is I find so much more interesting because like after the Watchmen movie and the comic book, there've been some prequel comic books that tried to expand on the characters, but not really take them in a new direction, not really bring them anywhere interesting. It just sort of harped on Watchmen. It didn't feel like it was like anyone was willing to progress with it. And I think that's because people have like a reluctance to pursue more with like Alan Moore material. Because like the one thing that I didn't mention with the film, but for most people who know Alan Moore's work, this is pretty much like a given. But Alan Moore wanted his name taken off Watchmen, and this is a common thing for Alan Moore. He doesn't like his name on anything based on his work. Like he wanted his name taken off of like V for Vendetta. Um, and a host of other films. Like the only thing I think, in fact, that Moore was okay with his name being on was an episode of Justice League Unlimited that adapted his comic book for the man who has everything. It was a Superman story where he believed that he was back on Krypton and lived a life with the family. It's a great comic book and it's a great episode. Um, and that's weird. That's just like the one thing that would carry his name is just a TV episode, but there you go. Like I think it's mainly because Moore despises what film adaptations come of his work. So naturally, like his name wouldn't be attached to the TV series too. So that's like, I mean, that's part of the course. We expect that by now. So the TV series, I was very reluctant on too. I was like, what are they gonna do with it? Are they just gonna retread the whole, nukes and the Cold War aspect and not really do anything with the characters? But I was actually really surprised. They placed Damon Lindelof in charge of it. He done work on stuff like Lost, and his more recent work was stuff like The Leftovers. Um, and I was surprised that the show had the balls to kind of like go with a sequel that would progress with like the ideas from the comic book. And I think that's a key point to mention here is that this is a continuation of the comic book. And there's a lot of like clues to it that it's more about the comic book than it was with the movie because like the movie left out quite a bit from the comic book. And this series is actually pretty interesting because it embraces it. It's like a continuation of the comic book. So if you haven't read it, that would definitely be a prerequisite for this. I wouldn't quite say it's a requirement. I think you can still enjoy this show without reading the comic book. But it does make the material ring a little bit more true and makes it more interesting, I think. It had great cast and they had a great mix of like interesting characters, which we'll go through now. So let's go to the next slide with our main hero here. And it's interesting because in this version of Watchmen, this is a bit more of a controversial choice. There are actually characters who are more like heroes who you do actually, identify with. And by the end, they actually seem to make the right choice in the end. So the primary character who we follow is Angela Abar. She's better known as Sister Knight, and she serves in the Tulsa police as a detective. She has an interesting history. She grew up in Vietnam, which in the comic book was conquered by the U.S. because of Dr. Manhattan, and because of Dr. Manhattan and Dr. Manhattan's influence, he became sort of like this kind of godlike figure in there where everyone kind of celebrates him. So she kind of has like this weird relationship with kind of like growing up with Dr. Manhattan as kind of like basically looked at as like a god from her part of the world. Um, Now she's very committed to taking down like her current mission within the police force is taking down a bunch of white nationalists. But she's also curious to unravel what happened with her past, which is kind of like remains in shadows, and she's still trying to figure it out. And when she does figure out the past, she's not quite ready for it. She's horrified by like the rocky road that went into what led up to the current version of superheroes. Because what happens in this story is that because it takes place after the events of the series, after the events of the comic, sorry, is that the law enforcement is much different in this world. After like law enforcement now has like restrictions on guns where they have to have clearance to use them, and because of this, it's sort of made the cops more targets. And because of this, the cops now don masks. Basically they become superheroes. They can either wear like yellow masks, like standard ones, or they can become themed superheroes. And some of the superheroes that form the police force are kind of ridiculous choices they have. Like there's a Russian called Red Scare, and there's one with a panda helmet who's just called Panda. Like that's it. So they choose these like masks and vigilante for these vigilante personas because they won't be as easily targeted. But then it creates this sort of concern about, well, if the cops can't be identified, how much accountability is there for them? And what I like about Angela is that she actually questions this the further that she goes. Like at first, she's committed to getting revenge on the white supremacists, But then she starts sort of questioning the actions of her police force and how much accountability they have within their organization, especially when they have to, especially when there's a lot to investigate in here. Um, so she's very much like the sympathetic hero of this story. Like you really want to root for her. I mean, she does have lessons to learn, but by the end of the series, you more or less feel like she gets to that next level. So go to the next slide here, and here's another hero, kind of, which is Wade Tillman, also known as Looking Glass. Now, what's interesting about Looking Glass is that he's kind of like the reverse of Rorschach. Not just merely because he has like the full face mask and all that. So Wade was present in 1985 during the squid attack in New York. So he lived through that. And because he believed it, and because the whole world believed that squids from another dimension were going to come and attack the Earth, Wade has done everything he can to protect himself after being traumatized from such an event. So basically, he dons this sort of like foil that's said to have interdimensional blocking properties, which we know is BS because we know that the squid didn't come from another dimension; it came from Adrian. But he sets up like this whole system in his house that's supposed to like protect from other dimensions. Like he's taking all these precautions. And he's not really a conspiracy theorist when you think about it, because everyone in the world has believed this, and they continue to believe it because Adrian has basically rigged up this system where baby squids will rain from the skies like every few days, just to remind you that, yeah, there's another dimension out there that's got squids and they're coming, so you better be prepared. So Wade has basically taken all the precautions. And what's interesting is that Wade actually does learn the truth that, Adrian had instigated it all. But rather than trying to find a means of sort of like tearing down the society that allowed Adrian to get to this point, Wade basically tries to find a way to hold Adrian accountable. So that's why I say it's like the inverse of Rorschach. It's like, Looking Glass was a character shaped by tragedy, but instead of taking that tragedy and developing it into nihilism, he tries to find some sense of justice, which is kind of obvious by the fact that he works for the police, but that becomes a little bit more intentional as the series goes on. So let's go to the next character on the slide, and here we have our first returning character, even though Dr. Manhattan doesn't really return until about like halfway through the series. So his revelation is kind of interesting. Like they pick up with the character, they pick up with where he was in the end of the comic, where he took off into different worlds to basically create his own life. And he did that for a while, but then he became bored with it and didn't know what to do with himself. So he came back to Earth and he went to Vietnam and he formed a relationship with Angela, but realizing that he couldn't quite make that relationship work because he's failed numerous times with the Silk Specters, he's decided that I want to wipe my memory and just live my life with Angela. What's interesting about this choice for the actor is that Dr. Manhattan chooses the form of a black man so that he can better blend in with Angela. Um, Now, some people who are reactionaries would look at this and say, "Oh, they're making this character black for diversity reasons." What's funny is that the show actually points this out. Like at one point, Adrian visits with Dr. Manhattan and looks at him and says, "Oh, you're changing your skin color. I don't know if I'd change yourself into a black man. You might be doing cultural appropriation here." As a little bit of a sting, but what's interesting I find about that is like, this is something that he can do. Like he's been able to change the color of his skin. Like this is something he's literally done in the comic books before. So there's like a whole bunch of weird aspects to consider with that. Especially since John becomes like a focal point of the story for trying to capture this power that John has wanted to keep hidden. So John like eventually has this power on Earth when he realizes he has to save the day, but he's also a target in the story as well. So this is the one thing that I think is really interesting about the show, is that it shows that, like in the comic book, it felt like there was a sense of hopelessness, that these heroes with all this power couldn't be stopped, they couldn't be contained. So there's like a darkness and a depression to it. In the show, it tries to showcase that, such power is not beyond grasp when the next generation can kind of figure out how to harness, um and sort of like take hold of that power for their own. And that's what a bunch of the characters try to do, specifically with Dr. Manhattan in this story, which I find interesting because it kind of makes John more sympathetic and more human, especially by the end of the show, which has a very tragic end for the character. So we'll go to the next character. And speaking of familiar characters, we have Adrian. So Adrian basically switched places with Dr. Manhattan from the comic book. So basically, like I said, John went off to another planet. He got bored. He came back to Earth and wanted his mind wiped. Well, Ozymandias made this happen for him, but he did it with a price, saying, "Hey, can I go to your world where you've created life so I can enjoy it?" Because the thing is, like, uh, Ozymandias is in a similar situation as Dr. Manhattan. He's kind of he's controlled the world, but now he's bored and tired with it. In order to keep up the illusion, he's got to keep the squids going. It doesn't really feel like he's done much. So Dr. Manhattan, Ozymandias takes off for the planet that John has created, and he spends his whole time here, like throughout like half the series, just just staging this own world that he wants. One where there's a rich manor, there's like a baron about the lands where he gets to reenact parts of history that he obsesses over. He even at one point stages his own trial so that he can sort of like face like punishment and feel some guilt for what he's done. But the thing is, he doesn't. It's just sort of like, a little play for him. Like during the trial, like he literally just farts in the faces of like the lawyers and everybody, because he doesn't care anymore. So there's just this reluctance to him. Eventually he does come back to Earth because like he tires of John's place too. And that's where he's kind of like held more accountable by the end of the series. Similar to Dr. Manhattan was kind of like defeated, Ozymandias is also kind of defeated by the end of the series. So his power is held in check. So let's go to the next slide. And we have another familiar character. So this is actually the continuation of Laurie Juspexik from the comic books, except this is a much different Laurie. So you notice that her name is now Laurie Blake, so she's embraced her father's name of, Edward Blake. But Laurie has a much different view of superheroes now because she's been so shocked and horrified by everything that happened in the comic. Now she hates superheroes. She's all against them. She kind of got into a bad relationship with Dan. Dan's in prison now, so he's pretty much out of the story. Laurie now works with the FBI in a division that is specifically against vigilantes and stopping superheroes, because she realizes they're nothing but trouble and they need to be held accountable. But the thing is, she can't quite let go of it either. Like, specifically, she can't let go of Dr. Manhattan. She's still in love with this dude, even though he's long past her radar. So she's very conflicted. Like, again, she's kind of like more of a good guy, like in the way that she's kind of more of a hero that she was in the comic book, and that you sympathize with her and you understand her situation. And here you're kind of, it's kind of interesting because she's kind of become the more gritty hero who's willing to, be a little bit more scrutinizing and a little bit more sinister in her tactics, when it comes to bringing vigilantes to justice, to make sure that there's not another Ozymandias or another Dr. Manhattan. So basically keeping all of them in check while still kind of longing for the past, the same way that her mother did in the comic book. So go to the next character. So we've talked a lot about heroes. So let's actually talk about a new villain on the block. So this is Lady True. So Lady True is basically the big new CEO on the block. She's developed all sorts of new scientific materials. She aims to grab the material of Dr. Manhattan so that she can use it for her own means. She wants to wipe out the white supremacists who also want this power for themselves. But the most interesting thing is that she's the daughter of Adrian. And she was actually a daughter born in haste. You might be wondering, well, like, who did Adrian hook up with? Because wasn't Adrian kind of like, wasn't he kind of like queer coded? Did he sleep with a woman? And I like the fact that they reveal how this happened, which is basically a maid who really hated Ozymandias, shot herself up with his stuff. So yeah, Lady True was basically born out of anger and rage. So you kind of have like this kind of like Lady Snowball situation where she feels like she has to get revenge. But basically, she wants to prove her worth to Ozymandias by saying that, look, I'm your daughter. I'm just as smart as you, as pretending that like that's hereditary, and says, look, lend me some money and I can do some cool stuff with the world. And Ozymandias just says, no, I didn't know you're my kid. I'm not giving you money. You build yourself up. And that's exactly what Lady True does. She not only built herself up to be a powerful CEO, but actually ends up being better than Ozymandias. She actually ends up saving him from the planet that he had stranded himself on. And yeah, she's basically kind of like the new Ozymandias on the block. She's incredibly smart. She uses scientific material to basically do what she feels is right for the world and tries to assume too much control in the end. So she kind of like falls into like the same pattern as her dad, more or less. All right, let's get to the next here. And this is the best character in the show. This is semi-joking. Okay, so in the show, Laurie works alongside FBI agent Dale Peedy. And Dale Peedy is basically big into superheroes. He knows all about them. He knows their lore. He studies up on them. So, of course, Laurie doesn't really dig him as much. But Peedy really does love superheroes. And at one point, he does become a superhero. In one episode, he becomes the character of Lube Man. And Lube Man is a pretty simple character. His character just dressed all in rubber. He carries around like lube or oil and just slides into sewers. And he only appears in one episode for 1 minute. And you don't even know it's Dale Peedy because he doesn't have any lines. It's just like Lube Man watches Angela disposing of some evidence, then runs away from her, coats himself in the oil, and then slips down to the sewers. And that's all we ever see of Lube Man, ever. So yeah, like the only way you know that it's Dale Peedy is if you read there's a marketing resource called the Peedypedia, which does mention that yes, indeed, Dale Peedy is Lube Man. But yeah, Lube Man only appears for one episode in 1 minute, and everyone obsessed over him. And it's hard not to be because he's such a mysterious character, and it begs questions of like where this character is going to go next if they do decide to do more Watchmen. So it's a fun little mystery. That's all I'll say about Lube Man. So I'll get to the next slide here. So getting a little bit more serious, this is the character of Will. And Will is the grandfather of Angela Abar. And the thing with Will, did we go to the next slide? Yeah, we gotta go to the next slide for Will Reeves. Yep, there we go. So Will is basically the grandfather of Angela. But what's interesting about him is that we later learned that he was actually the hero of Hooded Justice. Now, Hooded Justice was a character mentioned from the good old days in the comic book. And it's actually interesting because you actually read the biography in the comic book. It mentions that Hooded Justice never revealed his identity, that he never really talked too much about himself, and that there's a theory that he was a bodybuilder who mysteriously went missing around the same time that Hooded Justice just sort of faded from the scene. But what's interesting, I think, is that there's not a whole lot that's known about Hooded Justice. They do mention at one point in the biography in the comic book that he did harbor some sentiments towards the Third Reich. So he basically kind of favored little bit of like the Nazi culture, but didn't really talk much about himself. So um, in the show, they speculate that Hooded Justice was a white guy because it's revealed that he had a sexual relationship with Captain Metropolis. Now that would seem like a rumor, but here's like the interesting thing is that we later learn in flashbacks that that not only is it true that Hooded Justice did have sexual relations with Captain Metropolis, but that he was like a black man and a policeman as well. And it's basically like he felt that the world wasn't dealing out enough justice to racists, so Will took it upon himself to become the superhero of Hooded Justice and tried to do the right thing, even though it felt like he was still like a victim of like the propaganda that the racists were trying to pump out. Like at one point, he discovers a white supremacist organization called Cyclops. And Cyclops' whole deal is they want to use like hypnotic suggestion and propaganda to basically bring more people into the racist fold. And I especially love the episode where they reveal all this. It's an episode. The episode's called "This Extraordinary Being," and Angela basically sees all of this through what's called like a nostalgia drug. Like she takes this drug and she can see the life of Will. And she sort of like drops in and out of his story, like sort of like you see her in the background, or you'll see in a reflection of a mirror, sort of living the life that Will has lived. And when she lives that life, it's interesting because then she realizes that Will had such a rocky life in terms of being a vigilante and trying to stop the white supremacists that kind of like shakes her world. She's like, well, how do I stop it when my grandfather had this much problems with it? How do I do this? So like Will becomes like an interesting character, and also he also becomes like kind of like the conscience by the time the story keeps going, by the time the story reaches its end, because by the end of the show, Will basically has to talk with Angela, saying that you can't keep hiding under a mask. Wounds need air. You need to get the stuff out in the open, otherwise nothing is going to change. Nothing is going to be better. You have to be honest, and you have to unravel everything. And this actually plays in greatly with the themes of the show, because like the very first episode has the instigating the inciting incident is the 1921 Tulsa massacre, which occurred when Will was like a mere boy. So the Tulsa massacre was basically, there's a black part of town in Tulsa. There was a court trial there, and the court trial exploded into a war of violence between like white people and black people, where the Air Force was at one point called in to assault black people. And what's interesting about the Tulsa massacre is that for the longest time it was covered up, and that a lot of the details of this event weren't really revealed until like the 90s. And since then they've tried to like investigate it more, try to get more detailed records of it, try to identify who was attacked during that time. And what's really interesting about when the show was airing, it was airing in the fall of 2019, is that during that time there was like an article that came out that they had found a pit in Tulsa where they believed that some of the unmarked graves of the black people who were killed during the Tulsa massacre might have been. So it's interesting, like you're seeing like this unearthing of history happen in both the show and in our own lifetimes, and it's a really poignant bit of storytelling in that aspect, to realize that in order to learn from the past, it's not just enough to just read what's already been there. Like sometimes you actually have to dig into the past. You actually have to go looking for what happened, and you might not be, and you're going to be disgusted with what you might see. But it's important to have that out in the open, which is kind of like what Will stresses by the end of the show. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about what the show got right, which is quite a bit. The biggest thing I think that the show nailed was the theme of the comic book. So and when I say like the theme, I mean like being relevant to the times. Like in the Watchmen comic book, it was all about the Cold War. That was something that was on everyone's mind during the 80s. Nukes were getting ready to fly, and people had real fears about invasion and nuclear annihilation. It was a big fear that protruded into all aspects of media. So the Watchmen series basically does the same thing by tapping into a real fear that's more present now, which is the fear of of racism and not being able to combat it when people don't feel like it's an issue. And I kind of like how the show kind of sets up this environment in its own way that kind of feels like reflective of our current world, but also a little bit different. Like obviously it plays with the timeline a bit. I mean, in this version, Robert Redford is the president, so they have uh, I forgot what are they called? Reparations are paid for, except in this they're called Redfordations because of Robert Redford. But I like how they set up this whole premise where it seems like the racial issues are solved so that when someone does talk about, racism and like white supremacy, it seems like, it seems like it's like an embellishment when it really shouldn't be. Like it because like it feels like because reparations are paid for and you see more white and black families within suburban settings and more integrated neighborhoods, and because reparations are paid for, you'd think that the world would be a little bit more utopia, and it turns out not to be because it allows for more racism still bubbles up, and it's still something you have to confront, and it's just not there anymore. So it updates that theme to be more relevant. So if anyone feels like Watchmen shouldn't be talking about politics, please reread the comic book because the comic book is nothing but politics of the era. It is it is the most political comic book you will ever read. Um, at least to come out of like DC Comics. I don't think is it still like DC Comics or yeah, it's like I mean it's printed on DC Comics. Nowadays it would probably enter like Vertigo or Young Animal or something like that, but yeah, it's DC Comics. So keep that in mind. Yeah, I already mentioned that it brought up the Tulsa Massacre, which was very fascinating stuff to dig into. I dug into a few articles and looked at some of the photographs that were unearthed from that era that were actually pretty shocking. It builds on elements from the comic books. Like I said, there's a lot of little Easter eggs where if you've read the comic books, it'll pay off for you. And it's not like kind of like like a Marvel like, oh, you have to recognize this character and that they did this, like because they do set up the characters well enough. But if you have read the comic book, it's nice to see that sort of continuation. I mean, it's not very common that you see a comic book continue from the pages onto a television series. It's so uncommon that just that it works so well is perfectly. So you can go straight from reading the comic book to watching the show. Um, like I said, yeah, comments on the era perfectly, and it also questions the nature of heroism, just like it did in the comic book. Except I like how it takes a different swing towards the end of the series, where evil is actually punished rather than running as rampant as it does. So that was kind of like an interesting shift, I think, in terms of the material. So let's go to the next slide and talk briefly about what the show got wrong. So one aspect that I kind of had like a little bit of a problem with is because like the show is clearly against like far right, racist propaganda, but it also has to set up this it also has to take a bit of like a pendulum swing by setting it up that the aspects of like a more like liberal utopia would kind of like almost kind of like galvanize it. So like the problem is that like they set it up as kind of like a bit of like a liberal utopia. Cops have to have like restrictions on their guns. There's like a full minute of trigger warnings before any like violent or sexual programming is played. And yeah, like the whole like culture appropriation stuff like that. So it kind of walks the line here in a way that's kind of a little bit more even than the comic book was. Like the Watchmen comic book is clearly like heavily left leaning. Like you read everything in it, like and posing like who is the heroes, who is the villains, and what it's commenting on. It's clearly left leaning. And that's kind of like a little bit of a troubling aspect for the series, is that it kind of feels like it's trying to find a little bit like of a middle ground. And it's not saying that that ruins the show, but it does kind of feel like it pulls its punches a few times when it should be punching just a little bit harder now and then. It lingers on a few plots that don't really take off, and I'm not talking about the Lou Band. Lou Band's plot was fine. It's 1 minute. It's fine. But there's like a few like little aspects within like Angela's life. The aspects of like, cops hiding behind masks, and some of the heritage behind Angela, and Laurie's connection with Dr. Manhattan, that I feel like those aspects don't quite go anywhere. They linger, they meander, and like some elements of them kind of boil up in the climax, and some of them don't, which is a little bit troubling. It feels like, the script is a little bit meandering here and there. Um, and like, as much as I like the happy note that the show ends on, and the ambiguous note that I love that with that too, I feel like it might have like wrapped up like a little bit too easily. Um, Now, of course, like if you read into a little bit more, I think like the ending is a little bit more nuanced, where you question like how far will Ozymandias go when he's arrested, and if John is really gone with that power. Like the ambiguous ending is basically that Angela believes that she might have the power of Dr. Manhattan within her, that she can use it. And the show never fully answers whether she has the power or not. But I think it's an interesting question of like, if she does have the power, what's she going to do with it? Will she use it for good, or will she use it for evil? And more importantly, how will you know that you're using it for good if that's what you're trying to do? I think that's kind of like a little bit more out there. That like that might lead to an interesting second season if they do decide to do something like that. But it kind of, but like aside from the ambiguous ending, like everything wraps up just a little bit too neatly, I think. I mean, aside from like, Angela questioning like her vision of justice, it does wrap up just a little bit too neatly. So let's go to the final slide here. And so yeah, basically in summation, like the comic book's amazing. It's a great read. There's so much to read within here. Definitely, if you read it, if you've read it before, please reread it again. It's a very great read. I read it over like Christmas. Especially be sure, please, to read like the text heavy like excerpts between chapters, because they reveal a lot about the characters, and I think you'll appreciate the series all the more once you read into that, and also gives a lot more depth to the characters as well. The film is good on a surface level, but in terms of embracing like the actual themes of the comic book, it really falls apart. And this is inherent in like a lot of like Zack Snyder's stuff, where he does like everything that's more visual than stuff that's more visual and doesn't really carry any grander philosophical edge. Like you can see this in stuff like he's done with like Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, where his philosophy is kind of like questionable and all over the place. So it's a Zack Snyder Watchmen film. So that's pretty much you can get from that. And for the Watchmen show, I think it's a great continuation of the comic book. I think it does have some flaws here and there, but I think in terms of doing something like this, which I don't think has ever been done to this degree, of just jumping straight from a comic book into a TV show, continuing on with characters and stuff like that, it does really well, and it adheres to a lot of the themes of the comic book. So what Snyder's Watchmen are going to do, I think the show does really well. It builds on the comic book and takes it in an interesting direction. So yeah, that that's the panel. Yeah, I guess I kind of like I tried to like time it to see if I had time for questions. I don't know if we'll quite have time for questions. But yeah, it's just like yeah. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming out to the panel tonight. If you want to read more of my stuff, you can go to movieswithmark.com. And you can also read some of my reviews over at twincitiesgeek.com. There's a whole bunch of other places, but those are like the main areas. So yeah, I'll be doing some more panels throughout this weekend. So yeah, I'll see you soon. So thanks for coming out tonight.